Welcome back. We're going to continue with verse 6 of chapter 1 of Galatians, getting into the central part of the letter at last. If you remember, verse 6 says in the ESV, I am astonished that you are so quickly deserting him who called you in the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel. And so in the previous video, I stressed how there's really only one verb there. It's not deserting and turning. It's really just the verb for turning. They're turning away from one thing and turning toward another. And, for clarity's sake, and maybe for emphasis as well, I think English translations tend to split the verbs into two halves. So what I want to talk about now is the objects that they were turning away from and turning toward. And the first thing you notice about this is that they're not, Paul doesn't portray them as turning from one teaching to another teaching. He presents them as turning away from God's calling to a different teaching. Paul identified the gospel that he preached to the Galatians as being directly from God. He doesn't think of the gospel that he preached as being his own teaching in any way. What he presented to the Galatians was not Paul calling them, but God calling them in the grace of Christ. So, he presents the Galatians here, he presents a picture of what they're doing as they are turning away from God's calling, and they're turning toward a different gospel, a different teaching, a human teaching, which is not from God. And so Paul is going to actually talk a great deal more about this, about his understanding of the source of the gospel that he's preaching later. So I'm not going to dwell too much on that yet. But right from the beginning, that's part of his thinking, that the gospel that he's preaching is not his, but God's speaking through him. It's just the way Paul understands his life, his mission on earth. He's not acting on his own behalf, in other words. So let's talk about this gospel that he's preached, which he describes here as the calling in the grace of Christ, and the one who called them in the grace of Christ. The Greek phrase there is to kalesantos. And kalesantos comes from the Greek verb kaleo. Kaleo is usually translated as call. Its primary meaning is to call or name or address. For example, it's what we might say if we were in a conversation with someone, and we say, hey, I hear that you have a new baby in your family. And they respond, yes, we're going to call him Joe. It's the naming process. It's the addressing. We tend to think when we hear the word call, and this is part of Christian sort of theological mindset, we think of call as being to summon, to demand someone's presence, to demand or request someone's presence. And of course, the word can mean that. It does in several places in the New Testament. But what it primarily means is a less demanding idea, a calling in the sense of giving a name to someone. And I think that that's a large part of what Paul intends here in this verse, that they are deserting him who called them, who named them in the grace of Christ. The idea of giving a name, that God gives us a name, is something that goes right back to the very beginning of, in Genesis, the book of Genesis, when God called Abram, he changed his name to Abraham. In a very specific way. And he changed the name of Sarai to Sarah. Later on, when Abraham and Sarah finally have this promised child, and actually, when Abraham has a child with Hagar, Sarah's maid, God gives names to both of those children himself before they're born. Ishmael and Isaac. Isaac and Rebekah, then, they have twins, Jacob and Esau. And later, when God chooses Jacob to continue the covenant over Esau, God changes Jacob's name to Israel. He gives him a particular name. And it's a common idea through the Scripture that God gives a name to people when he establishes a relationship with them, when he establishes a conscious, deliberate kind of relationship. There is even a verse in the book of Revelation, which I neglected to look up, but it talks about that everyone has the secret name engraved, a name that God has given to them that only he and they know. And part of the idea here was that in the ancient world, the name, knowing someone's name, gave you a certain degree of influence or of power over them. There are myths, for example, among the Egyptians and among the Sumerians, where when one god found out the true name of some other god, that other god would have to, they would become, first of all, vulnerable to the power of the god who knew their name, and sometimes they would have to try to alter their name. The gods of the Egyptians went to great lengths to keep their names secret from the other gods because they didn't want anyone to have leverage over them. Now, you know how much of that works into the Hebrew idea of names? I don't know. But to know someone's name was it was a sacred thing. It was a special privilege to know someone's name, and you can see that partially in Moses, where God introduces himself to Moses and gives him this unique name that really belongs to him and Israel only. He hasn't revealed himself by that name to anyone else. It's private. And so I think that's part of what is going on here, that they're turning away from the God who named them, who gave them a name. The name carried the essence, the personality of the person. So, in a sense, to give a new name to someone, like when God gave a new name to Jacob or to Abraham, Sarah, he was changing their personhood. He was changing their identity. He was renaming them as a creature who was directly connected to him. He knew them by name. There's an intimacy involved in that. And I think that's part of what Paul is picking up here, that they are turning away from the God who named them in the grace of Christ, who gave them a new name, at least in the sense of establishing a new and intimate relationship with them directly. Not just a system of doctrine to be believed, but an entire connection that tied them to God directly. It's much more than simply believing a set of doctrines. And they're turning away from that to a different gospel, to this gospel that the people from Jerusalem are preaching to them, that unless they are circumcised, they cannot be saved. Now, here's a God who's given them an intimate personal name, who has named them as his own, and they're giving that up for the belief that unless they do this ritual, they've got nothing. And Paul's going to bring that out later on in the letter. He's going to emphasize how they're giving up something of substance for nothing. And the contrast here is very much embodied in that word grace. That's the second time he's used the word grace here. The one who called them, the one who named them in the grace of Christ. And this other gospel, all that the other gospel seemed to be altering was circumcision. Now, circumcision seems like a mighty trivial thing to us these days. Why should anybody get worked up about that if they really feel so strongly about circumcision? What the heck? Why not? Go ahead, have all the men circumcised. But Paul makes a big deal about it. I think, for one thing, there was a lot more than just circumcision that was at issue here. Circumcision was the tip of a much bigger iceberg. It was kind of the flashpoint for a much more expansive agenda that these teachers had in mind. But I think even if it were just the trivial issue that we tend to possibly think that it is, even if it were something trivial, Paul would still have regarded it as a turning away from the one who named them in the grace of Christ, adding anything as necessary for salvation, anything, however trivial, as necessary for salvation, is turning away from grace. And we'll talk about this more in the future, especially since I'm out of time now. So I hope to see you later.